Hello, Perugia. How are we? Hopefully you are well rested, notwithstanding shenanigans at the Brufani bar last night. Welcome for what is, it's not an easy topic. It's not something that, we want to sort of discuss while sipping an aperitivo, but nevertheless, it's an essential conversation, and we're really grateful that you are here and online as well. So today we're going to talk about the supercharging of the threat of online violence in the context of rising authoritarianism and the age of AI. So what we are finding in the era is that AI-assisted online violence is no longer looming. It's arrived, and it's reshaping the threat landscape for women who work in the public sphere around the world. In particular, women journalists, women human rights defenders, women activists, public intellectuals, lawyers, and so on. I'm Julie Pizzetti, and I'm Director of the Information Integrity Initiative at the NERV, which is a digital forensics lab established by the Nobel laureate Maria Ressa, who is sitting to my left. And I'm also chair of the Centre for Journalism and Democracy at City St George's University of London. And I lead the Tipping Point project, which is a study commissioned by UN Women that's examining how online violence is constraining women's participation in public life in the AI age. So we've surveyed women in 119 countries, in 5 languages, and today we're going to share some data from that research with you and talk a bit about the context, the implications, and potentially some solutions. So generative AI apps are really just the latest manifestation of this form of subjugation. They don't just nudify women and girls instantaneously without their consent and then simultaneously distribute that content via social platforms. They actually simulate them being sexually assaulted. So AI-assisted virtual rape is now at the fingertips of perpetrators. And according to our research, we found that 70% of women in these public-facing roles had experienced online violence in the course of their work. For women journalists, a group that's of particular interest here, obviously, that figure was 75%, so 3/4 of women journalists, we can now say, have experienced online violence while doing their jobs. And of that group who had experienced online violence, 1/4 of them, 24%, said they'd experienced abuse that was generated or amplified by AI tools. But it's important to note that we can't treat these AI-related findings as sort of isolated statistics. They exist within a spectrum of violence against women in public life, and they're also situated within a really unsettling pattern, and that is the vanishing boundary between online violence and offline harm. So we need to understand online violence as part of a continuum of violence against women. And we found, for example, that 41% of the women we surveyed had experienced offline attacks, abuse or harassment that they believed had been seeded through online attacks. In other words, there is nothing virtual about online violence. It's just the first, or at a point in the continuum, an act of violence that's part of a cycle of escalating harm. And that figure of 41% of women experiencing this escalating trajectory of online harm to offline violence is even more alarming when we discuss this figure in the context of journalists. So in 2020, I led a study for UNESCO called The Chilling, which found that 20% of the women journalists we surveyed then had experienced offline harm connected to online violence. This survey that we did for UN Women found that among the journalists who took the survey, 42% had experienced offline harm connected to online violence. This survey was conducted in 2025. the earlier survey for UNESCO in 2020. So over the past 5 years, the number of women journalists experiencing offline harm triggered by online violence has more than doubled. That's staggering. And in the context of AI, we know that the tools and algorithmic drivers behind abuse are deepening and worsening the impacts and speeding up the effects. So I'm joined today by Maria Ressa, who I've already introduced, who is a Nobel Peace Prize winning journalist, but who is here not just because she is an advocate for platform accountability, including with regard to gender-based online violence, but because she herself was really brutally targeted. So she will talk to us about her experiences. And Kaylee Williams, who is our senior researcher at the Information Integrity Initiative, and she's a student finishing her PhD at Columbia University, where she's studying nudification apps, which are really not just newsworthy, but a phenomenon that is shifting public debate about online violence against women in public life. And also Calliope Mingaru, who is the head of the section to end violence against women at UN Women. And so I think I'll start with you, Maria, because it's always really important to centre these conversations around women who have experienced this kind of violence. And I remember when we first started talking about this, and I wrote about it at the time back in 2016 or 2017 for a UNESCO study, what you were experiencing then was, you know, egregious. It was hideous. It was, for example, you know, the figure that I recall very vividly from those days was that you were at one point receiving 90 hate messages a day. Now those were... Per hour, sorry.
Per hour, guys.
Yeah,
90
per hour.
hate messages per hour.
And that was text-based abuse, right? These are messages coming via text. And then we started to see the memes, you know, the picture-based memes, the queen of fake news, and one particularly hideous example where you had male anatomy kind of attached to your face, cheap fakes, if you like. And more recently...
Scrotum face was the nickname they made.
And more recently it's morphed into, you know, deepfakes. But can you, I mean, just like start by telling us about that hideous cheap fake meme with the testicles, because that's...
First of all, good morning. You know, aside from all the horrible things that we are living through, you know, if you're a woman journalist or if you're a woman online, you know this, and I think we can talk about some of the ways we deal with it. I was just a little bit ahead, and the way we grappled with this was to understand the data that was coming at us. But the other part is I'm looking at the audience to find the men, right? So if you're next to the man, if you're next to a man, please give him a hug, because, yeah, see, I like this, right? Like, because this online violence, so by the Nobel lecture, so we came under attack in 2016, and I have one of our original researchers in Rappler, and then a nerve researcher, Gabby Baezes, with me. This is her first time in Perugia, but, you know, like, I had no idea. First I thought, oh my gosh, like people don't like what I'm doing. You think it's about you, it's not. It was narrative information operations was the word we used, but increasingly from the time Julie and I met, she convinced me to go public with it. Because at the beginning, you're kind of ashamed of it. Right? I'm not corrupt. There's nothing that you can... I spent a life as a reporter, 20 years as a reporter for CNN in Southeast Asia. I ran 2 bureaus. So they couldn't find anything. What did they do? They looked for anything that would make me feel vulnerable. I have dry skin. I have eczema. So that's what Julie referenced. This scrotum face was what they did. Every time my team did something incredible, an investigative report, an award, it would come up and they would make my face look horrible at the beginning. It does make you feel vulnerable, but then, you know what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but be careful of saying the word kill. It's not a good time to say that. And then it evolved beyond that. The platforms did not take it down because they said, Maria, you're a public figure. The Philippines has a constitution like the United States. There are protections for journalists, which the platforms actually always forget. Now, we have Deepfakes AI, right? So we've traced through NERV a Russian scam network pushing out a deep fake of me selling crypto. If you see it, it's not me, but it sounds like me, it looks like me. Most recently, I have a deep fake that is me telling anyone with diabetes to throw out their insulin. Don't listen to that. How do you deal with this, right? The way we dealt with it was to look at the data and to tell you how you're being manipulated. We showed it. The next step should be strategic litigation, but how do you do that when our deep fake on the Russian scam network originated outside of the Philippines? In fact, we found Russian scam network, we found Hong Kong, we found all the different places, right? So, sorry, I will summarize this. You will feel vulnerable, you're not alone, and I worry about the next generation, right? The impact of this. This is free speech, used to stifle free speech, and the attack on women, first sexist and now misogynistic, is designed to push women out of public life. And that's
Absolutely.
something. Sorry, I'll shut up. I can talk forever.
We don't want her to shut up, definitely not. And we called the study for UNESCO the chilling for that exact reason, because it is about trying to shut women up and push them out of public life.
We won't shut up, right, ladies?
Yeah. But we need to keep talking. And I think, Maria, you raised a couple of really important points there. And one is that in many instances, we see these attacks as a sort of aspect of geopolitical, strategic silencing. Which is designed to chill critical reporting, human rights work, for example, and also the monetization of abuse, through the crypto.
And the sex, right? The kind of very pornographic videos. And so Senator Laila de Lima, who was anti-Duterte, she's a former Justice Secretary in the Philippines. She was targeted, and the videos and photos that came out, and this was before AI really took over. She was shamed in our House of Representatives with them. She was jailed for almost 7 years and released, right? She was jailed unjustly. So all of this can and may be used against you, but no, you are not alone. We can track it for you. We can work together to fight this. And frankly, we should be demanding better, right? Yeah. We should be demanding better.
Absolutely. And the highly sexualized nature, the misogynistic nature of these attacks has indeed been supercharged by apps such as nudification apps. And Kaylee, in your work, you have spent unfortunate amounts of time ploughing through the chat rooms frequented by users of nudification apps. You have studied and audited these tools in research which is forthcoming and in progress, and in your work with us on the UN Women's Study. Can you just tell us what you have found so far about the implications of this technology and how it shifts the phenomenon of online violence into a new space?
I can certainly try. Thank you all for having me. Really honored to be on this extremely esteemed panel. So I think it bears repeating what Maria's already said, which is that so many women in public life, and journalists especially for this crowd, have been facing the non-consensual sexualization that we are seeing now as assisted by AI for many years. This is not unique to generative AI, although it is highly exacerbated by. And so what I've tried to track is the process through which new technologies truly scale up and make this behavior, this practice, this abuse of creating this content more accessible, easier to access, easier to view, easier to create. And so now what we have is really there are a few different sort of infrastructures. We have the nudification apps, as they are most colloquially called, which are really specific, unique and specifically purposed for the creation of non-consensual intimate imagery, based on real photos, right? with as little as one real, one authentic image being used as prompt material. We also...
And these apps basically, like just to, in case anyone is unaware, these apps basically take an image of a real person, or can be a real person, and they may be fully clothed to start with, but they are literally stripping them bare.
So what we've seen, I've done quite a bit of analysis of these, and essentially you, across the board, see these very video game-like interactions, these UI infrastructures that allow folks, users, to upload an image of a real person and then select the body features that they would like to see, select the quote-unquote outfits that they would like to see that person dressed in, which might range from nothing, right, all the way into sort of fetishized content, things like bondage outfits, things like schoolgirl uniforms. They also allow for the posing and the creation of videos that, depict, as you say, victims who have not consented and are largely unaware that this is being done in any manner of pornographic material, much of which I've seen is overtly violent and is overtly abusive. So one of the websites I have looked at in depth really advertises that there are no limits to this technology, and unfortunately that's been the case.
And so what we're seeing now is not just the kind of more crude deepfakes, and I don't know if Carol Cadwallader is in the audience, but she's one of the journalists whose experience of online violence we've studied. And I remember, a deepfake involving her where her head was superimposed on the body of another person from a scene from a film. But what we're seeing now is so hyper-realistic that it really does deepen the trauma, doesn't it, when you realise you have been subjected to this. And Kaylee, can you talk to us a little bit about the ways in which this is proliferating? So, what is the scale of this crisis, and how are we seeing, this kind of egregious material which is created or prompted on an app or on one site spill almost seamlessly via social media into the public sphere?
Yes, so this is the latest development that has really been keeping me up at night, and that is the introduction of the practice, the norms around nudification technology that started as a niche community online, a niche interest, let's say, and then now has been effectively integrated into mainstream social media this year via X and via Grok. So this year we saw the first instance of users of a mainstream platform being able to use that platform's own embedded Gen AI bot to create non-consensual intimate imagery. And I can describe some more examples, but really the content that we saw coming out of Grok included children in large numbers, included just some of the most humiliating and degrading sexually explicit imagery you can think of, and was specifically used on women in public life, so politicians, journalists, because anytime a photo was posted, you can simply reply in the same thread and say, put this woman in a bikini. And then it became, put her in a bikini made of dental floss. It became, put her in a bikini and cover her in milk. These things, it only escalates. I mean, I can list a few. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate did an investigation after the fact and found that over 11 days between December and January, Grok generated 3 million of these sexualized images, roughly 2,300 of which depicted minors. So that's where we're at.
Yeah, so it's not just women in public life, of course, it's children. And this material stays up, and we can come to policy and regulatory responses in a moment. But I think it's important to note, actually, that Elon Musk himself is the subject of a case ongoing in the US currently connected to one of these episodes of the sort of grokeification of these nudified images involving his former partner, the mother of one of his many children, and you know, there is an attempt to get some justice for women affected by this. But it's not. My point is that there's active participation by the originators and producers of these technologies in certain instances. So this is the term brodagarchy really sums up, I think, the kind of challenges we're dealing with here. And Kaylee, you highlighted the ways in which women politicians in particular are being targeted. And one of the most shocking examples I've seen recently, actually, was a UK MP who was campaigning for regulation of nudification apps. And so, as you can, I'm sure, guess, was targeted in a campaign of online violence using nudification apps. One of these videos that went viral was a deepfake of her being chloroformed and prepared for rape. I mean, this is just staggering stuff. And I think, Calliope, it highlights the context in which we're operating, right? Where you have the evolution of the manosphere in combination with these tools to not just systematically abuse women at scale, but also seeing the ways in which these technologies are being used to facilitate the rollback of very hard-won rights to gender equality. So from a UN Women perspective, can you just talk to us about how you're seeing this phenomenon manifest itself and the concerns you have broadly for women in public life as a result?
Thank you so much, Julie, and good morning. Such a good audience we have today for such an important issue, such important research, Kaylee. I have to say from UN Women's perspective, what you have just mentioned, of course, we're very, very worried. That's why we commission reports like the Tipping Points with such esteemed leading researchers like you yourselves, and in order to know more about the extent and the impact of digital violence on women in public life more broadly. But now we have a very particular context, the pushback, the backlash to gender equality and women's rights more broadly. And just to let you know, for example, some of the research that UN Women has been doing, a quarter of countries around the world has been affected by this backlash to gender equality and women's rights. And just, for example, we have weak legal protections, in more than 50% of countries that they have very low legal protections for women's rights in general. And less than 40% of countries, they do have laws on digital violence, for example. And on top of that, we have already institutions that they deal with gender equality and violence against women and girls that they have been dismantled around the world. And to make it even worse, we have serious funding cuts to women's rights organizations, to advocates. And I'm sure some of they have been advocating for addressing violence and digital violence, including against women in public life. But because of serious funding cuts, we have some serious backlash to the advocacy that women's rights organizations are doing to address it. So this is a very serious context. And you mentioned the manosphere and the incels. You mentioned already how some of these extreme phenomena now they are mainstreamed in social media, for example. And I think when we are talking about digital violence, it's not a new phenomenon. You mentioned, Julie, that it's a part of the continuum of online, offline violence. And of course, women in public life have always been targeted. You mentioned women politicians, women human rights defenders, and more broadly, women in public life, journalists, of course, always. But now what we see, that digital spaces, technology, they have really accelerated the pace of these violations, and the impact and the extent is even greater. And the scale, the speed, the anonymity behind these attacks and violations, they make it even harder to address impunity. And we talked about impunity before of perpetrators. And the manosphere, the incels communities that we see in digital spaces, it's really spaces where we see that misogyny is getting fueled. We see that younger men and boys, they're really shaping their attitudes and behaviors towards so many issues. And something that it's really ignored, I think, by governments and more broadly, is that very often it's not just misogyny and violence against women and girls, but it's very much linked with violent extremism and extreme radicalization that it's compounded with racism, with homophobia, and all kinds of extreme manifestations. So I think it's very, very important to see as well how, and you mentioned the algorithmic amplification, right? And also you mentioned as well the monetization infrastructure that we have. They're very, very particular of how the exposure of men and boys to a rather harmless content in the beginning through gaming, through dating platforms and apps, for example, through fitness, and through specific influences, very quickly they're getting exposed to really harmful and violent content. And that's how they're shaping.
Yeah, indeed. And there's substantial research now indicating that referrals, for example, to worse and worse and more violent content, if you are exposed to one piece of violent misogynistic content, you are much more likely on a platform like YouTube, for example, to quote one study, to be directed to even more violent content. So this sort of, you end up trapped in this cycle of escalation, which indeed, as other research has shown, and Calliope, you've said, the connection to radicalization and violent extremism connected to misogyny. But this is a project that in the context of rising authoritarianism has become harder and harder to address because of the kinds of, foreign policies that exist within some states designed to curtail efforts to support gender equality. And, I know, for example, that UN Women has faced massive budget cuts, right? So this is yes, continuum of violence in a cycle of kind of radical efforts to wind back rights. And so if we can come now to the ways in which we might address this, Maria, I mean, you work in different contexts with intergovernmental organisations, with individual member states, with civil society and so on. And we've talked for a long time about the need for integrated responses to online violence, holistic responses in terms of support networks and so on. But what is needed, at a transnational level? What can and should be done from a regulatory or legislative perspective, for example, from the point of view of political will to actually address this?
Yeah. So again, I will echo, there's a lot of you here. You walked all the way down the hill, so you are awesome, because I think here's some solutions. Because it's been a decade now, minimum, where it is, there's that weird TFGBV.
Yeah.
These
I mean, in
acronyms.
2009 was the first research published about this phenomenon. So we're talking 17 years or 16 years.
So several things. I think the first is realize this in the physical world, right? In Rappler, within 3 to 6 months of the attacks against us online, we had to increase security significantly. Within the first year, we increased security for our folks 6 times. So that means cost. But in the real world, please, get together, right? They're calling them civic circles. So in the real world, 8 to 15 people who are your close friends, systems of trust. In Rappler, when one of us was attacked, that person didn't necessarily respond. We swarmed. There were earlier things. Again, this is 2016, right? But then let's move it beyond. What are the systemic ways we can fight back? And we're seeing this. In fact, tomorrow, in Barcelona, 17 heads of states are coming together around information integrity. And this is a critical part because the tech is changing, is not just abusing women, it's abusing men. Right? We're seeing this. It is changing human behavior. And the heads of states who are meeting tomorrow, we will look at not just disinformation, not just the attacks against women, but straight across the board. How does all of that begin the funnel that goes down to changing our societies, changing our democracies, actually killing our democracies? That's one. The other one is, let's go to the science. Right? And the science, I co-chair with Joshua Bengio from Canada, who's a Turing awardee, the UN's AI scientific panel. And again, we're meeting next week in Madrid for the first time. What are we after there? The scientists are now looking at this, right? By July, we hope to be able to give you a baseline for policy, because where does it go? The reason I mentioned civic engagement first is it always goes back to the people. If there is no pressure on governments, this doesn't happen. And it's not just individual governments. Demokrasya Siyempre is 24 heads of states at last year's UNGA 80. But that's not enough, right? And I think if we don't demand this now, 2026 is such a tipping point year. So science, the journalists, we're too fragmented. Our news organizations aren't coming together enough. And that means you're not demanding this enough. And then civil society. It's a whole of society approach to change it, and I think this has to be a tipping point year to do that.
Yeah, and I think strategic litigation is a really important part of this, and we haven't got a lot of time to go into details, but there are some creative legal challenges to the manifestations of this work.
But we can pick this up from California and New Mexico, where we don't look at it as speech, we look at it as platform design, right? Because it is about to get worse with the chatbots. It already has.
Well, it is, yeah, it already is, exactly. And Kaylee, it's also, increasingly hard. The scale is one part of the problem, and the believability of the material is another part of the problem. But so is the difficulty in detecting this kind of material and analysing it, right? So to bring it back to the personal, though, and to try and sort of focus solutions at the individual level, I'm interested in what you have observed in your study of the men who are participating in this kind of abuse prompting. What have you observed? What kind of characteristics do we need to understand about those who are perpetrating this?
Sure. Several great points raised there that I can speak to. I mean, so on the point of detection, I think first, it's important to know that there are no good tools yet for detecting this sort of content, and that is what makes the pursuit of policy mitigations and interventions so difficult. Another issue, looking to the intervention side, is the way that we understand the communities and the reasons that folks fall into this perpetration and into this behavior. So in the US, we have a tradition of thinking in terms of what is colloquially known and problematically known as revenge porn, right? Content that is captured or created and then distributed as a means to humiliate, to degrade, or to seek revenge on a person that you typically, according to this folk theory, know personally. My analysis of the community, and there is a community that surrounds what they are calling deepfake pornography, is challenging that assumption about how this content comes to be. And I am finding that much less so than seeking revenge, let's say, we see so many users come to this content from a perspective of thinking not at all about their victims, thinking so little about the implications of the abuse, about not understanding that this is abuse in itself. And so this makes regulation difficult because it has implications for levels of liability. It has implications for when a crime has occurred.
So intent.
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
And I think that many of the places that are seeking to get creative with interventions often has to do with looking at alternatives to criminalization. So things like likeness rights, platform requirements in terms of taking down content that is reported, things like this.
And regulating the technology itself as a matter of public safety rather than this false argument about speech, which we have
product
heard.
liability.
Exactly, and product liability, precisely. And I mean, Calliope, your role at UN Women, not your individual role, but UN Women's role in the UN system is to try to educate and inform states about policy solutions to really serious problems. And one of the things, that I have noticed, a positive point perhaps, is that the shocking nature of what's been exposed about the ramifications of this phenomenon, about just the visceral, disgusting nature of some of the material, has actually prompted male heads of state, for example, Keir Starmer in the UK, to move in ways that they have not previously moved on regulation, and finally to stand up to the big tech bosses and to say this is unacceptable and we will find a way to regulate to ensure that this material, that this technology is actually curtailed and required to comply with in motion, legislative efforts. But from your perspective, Calliope, what do states, what do governments need to understand about the function of these companies that profit so extremely from this kind of material, in terms of what they need to do to hold the technology companies and their owners to account?
Yes, thank you. First of all, to say that we see some increased political will, as you said, in order to have some laws, regulation and policies in place and some programmatic action in order to address digital violence, but still we are lagging behind, especially because technology, deepfakes, AI are moving fast. And governments and our partners cannot really keep up with the pace of the technology, AI and deepfakes. So I think it's very important to understand the extent, the pace and the scale so we can move faster.
So you still need the data, you still need the research.
We still need
analysis.
The data and research. That's why it's so important. And also we're going to have some new data coming up on the 28th of April. I thought it was March still. 28th of April from the tipping point. But also to understand how to have some prevention models in place in order not only just to regulate and to criminalize, but how can we stop it before it starts? And that's why...
At the design level.
Exactly. So safety by design, for example, it's very important. And of course, the regulation of platforms is important and having the codes of conduct and the standards in place. But how can we have some early detection in place and how to make sure that the misogynistic and really harmful content is not getting circulated in the first place? And if I can say something there, and you're aware of our research, forthcoming research findings that we have with the Equimundo, supported by the ACT program, supported by the European Union and Iceland, on doing exactly what you suggested before. How can we really find more information about the drivers of such perpetration? And we don't have enough research and enough information about who the perpetrators, the profiles of the perpetrators, as you were saying, Kale, before, and what is it driving them to have this kind of violence that very often gets into the real world. So we're going to have these research findings very soon. We will start with South Africa and Brazil. And then we will see, based on that, how we can create tools? Because you said we don't have enough information. So how can we create tools and prevention models and using technology as well where appropriate in order to change the narrative?
Yeah. And I mean, so obviously this research and the development of tools take time, but at a regulatory level, there is, a terribly urgent need for there to be, at a country level, and states within federated countries, responses that treat this as urgently as it needs to be treated. I want to go to the audience now for questions. Again, I know it's a sobering topic. We have one question up the back, one here and one here, one over there. So if you can take those microphones around. And who has a microphone in their hand already? Anyone? Yes. So do you want to stand up and, if you're comfortable, tell us your name and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Fatima, and I'm a program manager at Internews. And I wanted to ask you, the conversation is really rich and very interesting, but I felt that it's perhaps missing the conservative countries. And I come from Syria, and at the moment there are lots of Syrian women that are being affected by this online gender-based violence, and not necessarily if they are journalists themselves or even public figures, but sometimes if they are family members of men in the public sphere. So I was wondering also, my question is if you have any, recommendations, because women are now not confrontational enough in Syria, for example, because they don't want their families to get affected. So it's not only affecting one person, but it's affecting even the community sometimes. So how can we also mitigate this? Thank you.
Thanks. I'll respond to that while we wait for the microphone to go up the end, and then if anyone else wants to come in as well. So, your point is really well taken on two fronts. And we reported on this in the Chilling, actually. It was a 15-country study that very much tried to emphasize global majority experiences. And in countries where the implications of online violence spilling into offline harm are extreme, that is where emphasis needs to be placed in understanding the particular cultural elements that are in play there, and the ways in which we see online violence radiate beyond the individual target to family members, specifically to the mothers of women who are targeted and the children of women who are targeted. But in more culturally conservative countries, we see a phenomenon of the shaming of men who are connected to those women, and the kind of creation of a risk profile of the women being targeted designed to get their parents to convince them that they should withdraw, right? So you're absolutely right, and we do see this phenomenon. I mean, the research on AI-oriented or assisted abuse of this kind, particularly looking at nudification, for example, is very fledgling, and we haven't yet got data beyond some of the Western contexts. But the survey we have done is global, and we did have strong participation from majority world countries. Before we go to the next question, does anyone else want to respond to what
I'm just going to pull this up, because yes, it's the same. The same things are happening in the Philippines. We're Asia's largest Roman Catholic nation, right? Of course, there's Pope Leo, but ultimately, we're a downstream. When we try to address each of our individual problems, it is a whack-a-mole game, right? With greater dangers for individuals trying to do it and our families. So this is where legislation moves up, right? This is power and money. Power and money, right? The attacks against us, men and women, come because they want power. And who is responsible for this? This goes back to the tech companies that are making more money and gaining more power, and goes back to the business model. We haven't talked about that. Surveillance capitalism, which has commodified our humanity. So for me, really, truly, let's move upstream and push for the laws that should protect us.
Can we go to, who's got a microphone? So there's also a question up the back. I can see you waving your hand, and she has been asking for a microphone for some time. So I'm going to make sure you get to ask the question next. Do you want to stand up and tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Saleh Hamoud. I do a research, I have a PhD in AI and comms and media. a long time ago when it was really not a mainstream AI back then. But now listening to you, I know it's all about legislation, but to be realistic a little bit, I mean, with what is happening, even presidents, the US president has been using and normalizing fakes, or I don't know if we can call it deepfakes anymore, but it has been mainstreamed, and the tech companies have been protected a lot and elevated to a lot of more power. So my question is, I believe that at the moment, tech companies are more powerful to be able to really push for legislation. So I believe that maybe educating people is the only way, and as you said, it's about science, civil society, and journalism. However, my question is, if you start educating the children on that, would that be something that we can push for? Because we cannot focus on all the segments of the society to be really effective. I come from Lebanon as well, and we have similar and more problems maybe. So this is not a priority to us. That's what I'm trying to say. So
Yes.
I had a conversation with the Ministry of AI, and they were just pushing for partnerships with tech companies without thinking of anything related to digital safety or to education.
As though the tech companies would go into these partnerships with
Yes,
good intent
yes.
rather than protecting profits. I'm going to ask colleagues to respond to that, but I want the microphone to go up to the woman who's been very persistent with her hand high in the air up the back. Thanks for that question. Who would like to respond?
Could I take this one?
Yes, go Kelly.
Because I think you make two extremely good points. So my research has really led me back to sort of the feminist fundamentals around, the importance of public awareness around consent, the importance of understanding and building systems that justify and protect women's bodily autonomy. I mean, these are things that I came up thinking we had all agreed upon, and am finding now in my research that perhaps it's backsliding, perhaps that was never true. But I think that coming back to those fundamentals is going to be so important in the time ahead. I also want to point out, to your point about tech regulation, that all of the platforms, the major social media platforms, make public statements. They have public community guidelines that say, right, that they value consent, that they want to protect their female users. And that's something that is often used as a marketing point, as a PR, talking point. And I just want to point to the difference between using these values as a signal, as a public signal of solidarity with women, and then actually demonstrating that solidarity with women.
Indeed, and we see this from interactions with news organisations through to the halls of the UN, where they turn up performatively to say they want to do X, Y, and Z to protect women online, and then this is the shit show that we're left with. I have to be frank. And the question up the back, I hope you finally have a microphone now. Do you want to...
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for this discussion. My name is Lisa Kuzmenko. I'm the head of Women in Media NGO from Ukraine, and also I'm a journalist. And thank you for your Chilean study. We use it a lot in Ukraine when we trying to deal with this topic. At first, my question was that in Ukraine, women war correspondents and anti-corruption journalists and those who write about LGBTQ rights and feminism, they are among the most frequently targeted. And my question was, if platforms and AI developers already know their system amplify abuse at scale, at what point does this inaction become complicity?
Yeah.
But now my next question is how we, okay, it's an obvious question, but how we could support women journalists in all this difficult system.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And this is a very important question. I know we're technically out of time, but I am going to give a response to this question. There's two questions which are tied up. we have found in our research, which has included an as yet to be published study on the targeting of women journalists in Ukraine and studying the ways in which they are being abused, harassed and endangered. And important to understand that there cannot be a more dangerous environment for an online violence campaign directed at a war correspondent in a war zone. And Ukraine is a prime example of that. And your point about whether or not these companies recognise that they are complicit, I think is best illustrated by the ways in which, for example, Meta, originally known as Facebook, has fought and continues to fight against an inquiry at the UN level into the ways in which Facebook had a determining role, in the words of the UN investigators, in the Myanmar genocide. There can be absolutely no doubt that they are aware that they are, in fact, facilitating and arguably are complicit in the risks and the impacts of these technologies on extremely vulnerable communities. And I will just finish the panel by going back to points that have been made by others, that the ways in which we can help one another include solidarity, include creating safe physical spaces where we are not trying to use these platforms to advocate and to create a solidarity movement and to organise, whether it's through legal means or for regulatory reform. But also, I think it's really important that we keep talking about this issue and tracking and monitoring the way it's changing, and never forget women like you and our colleagues from Syria and Lebanon who are experiencing the most horrific impacts of this violence, where it's often undermined and forgotten because it's not real-world violence. Well, I'm here to tell you that the data says it is, and it continues to be a massive risk. So thank you very much for joining us here today. I want to highlight what Calliope said, which is that we have a new report in the Tipping Point series coming out on the 28th of April in time for World Press Freedom Day. UNESCO is also a partner on this work, and it really presents some terribly alarming data on the rates of self-censorship involving women in public life who are exposed to online violence, and truly shocking data on the mental health impacts and the number of women in public life diagnosed with serious mental health conditions as a result. So please, I know that data is depressing, but help us by engaging with this material and distributing it and demanding the change that we need to see. Thank you very much, and go out into the sunshine now.